Great, thank you for that introduction, John. Right, let's see. Can you see my slides?
Let's see. Yes, we can see. I can see your. Yes, we see your first slide now. Perfect.
Great. All right. Thank you very much. All right. Well, hello, everyone. Thank you for joining tonight. I am going to, as John said, talk a lot about native plants out there. And some of this presentation was shared through a New Hampshire Lakes webinar that was offered about a year or two ago, but I have gone in and tailored it specifically to the Acton Wakefield watershed, lakes and ponds. So the information that I'm going to share on particular plants in the part of your state will be specifically to you guys. I am going to turn off my video so that I don't have any disruptions with bandwidth on my end. So we'll just dive right in. And I guess pardon the pun on that. So let's see. All right, there we go. Before we jump in, a lot of times when we're talking about aquatic plants, we talk about invasive aquatic plants, and those are typically the plants that we don't want in our water bodies. But I'm going to just give you the definitions of native and invasive, just so that we're clear. Tonight, I'm just going to talk about native plants. There are lots of resources out there for invasive species, including some recorded webinars from elsewhere. I'm also glad to come back at some other point and talk strictly about invasive plants if you have that interest. But native plants are those species that were here before European colonization, basically. Before anybody came here and brought plants from their homeland with them. So they're species that have evolved over time within this area. An invasive species is a species that's non-native. So it hadn't evolved here and it was purposely brought in or accidentally brought in. And the specific characteristics about an invasive are that non-native characteristic, but also they can cause economic and ecological harm, and they can cause harm to human health. And that's a federally recognized definition for an invasive plant. Some of the common invasive plants in your area that you might be familiar with are variable milfoil, which is in Balch Pond, and hydrilla, which is over just outside of your watershed, I think, in a pond just, I think, maybe 8 or so miles from the state border. But that one actually has been eradicated. So you have a little smattering of a couple invasive plants in the area, but not a whole lot of different threats immediately in your area. So, oops, somehow I jumped ahead. So on the agenda, the specific things I'm going to talk about are the functions and values of plants. These are, I guess, we like to assign value to plants for, I guess, our own reasons, but they do have a lot of values in the ecology of aquatic systems. So I'll talk about that. I'll talk about some of the rare, threatened, and endangered aquatic plants we have in New Hampshire. A lot of times we don't think about those being in lakes. We might think of those as being like an orchid on land or some other type of very rare plant species, but we do have several of them in lakes and ponds. I'll talk about lake basin aging. Many of you have probably heard of eutrophication or the lake aging process, and I'll talk about how that affects aquatic plant communities. And then I'll talk about zonations, where you can tend to find these plants. And then I'm going to jump into that topic of, should I manage it or should I not manage it? And I get that question a lot from shorefront property owners about plants that are growing that they might not want in a particular area. And I'll talk about management options and costs related to management as we go through. So first up, aquatic plants have a lot of good value to aquatic systems. They provide surfaces on which algae grow, and that's important because a lot of young of the year fish and tadpoles and other organisms like to graze on algae underwater. Plant communities and lakes also provide a hiding spot for zooplankton, or the microscopic animals in the water, and for fish as well. So we need that habitat out there. Some of our plants also provide shade. If you guys think about looking out at the lake in the summer and you see the lily pads that are out there, those actually act like little umbrellas and they provide shade to the water column. Our aquatic plants produce a lot of oxygen, which is really important for aquatic life. When we're out measuring oxygen, when oxygen concentrations fall below a level of 5 milligrams per liter, aquatic life can be impacted. So our plants are providing lots and lots of oxygen to the water column, along with algae and atmospheric oxygen mixing in. Plants also cycle nutrients. If you have nutrients coming into a lake from runoff or nutrients that are generated in the lake naturally by recycling of nutrients, something is going to use them. And it's going to be a tug of war between the algae using the nutrients and the plants. And if the algae get it all first, you're going to have a lake that's dominated by algae and it's going to be less clear and kind of murky. But if you have a mix of plants and algae, you'll have a clearer lake with better clarities. Aquatic plants provide food for critters and people. They also provide a lot of shelter building materials for insects and birds. They stabilize the bottom so that you don't have sediment that's stirred up as easily into the water column. Some of these are very pretty to look at. They provide macroinvertebrate habitat, and macroinvertebrates are bugs underwater. And this photo here gives you a really good example of that. On the top left of that plant is a cast off shell of a dragonfly that hatched out. And then on the right in the middle, those are 2 damselflies that are using the plant as a little resting spot as they are in their reproductive process. And then some plants also provide fibers for weaving and thatching. Back a couple hundred years ago, people used to use reeds and rushes and grasses for caning of chairs and also for roof material for houses. So lots of benefits from these different plants. Taking a look at the secret life of plants, this sounds kind of interesting, but we have a lot of carnivores that are in our waters. We have 3 specifically. Pitcher plants are something that a lot of people probably are more familiar with. But we also have sundews, which are really tiny, that are low growing plants. And then bladderwort. Bladderwort's often a frustrating plant because it acts like the tumbleweed of lakes. It just kind of drifts around and it washes up on shore. But that's a little carnivore. And I'll show you some pictures of that. You can actually see a picture of bladderwort over here on the right side of the screen. And if you look closely on the leaves, there are these little black dots. Those are actually the bellies of this plant. So it is a little carnivore. It eats microscopic tiny organisms. There are some fun plants to play with. Jewelweed, which is in the upper right picture, is a plant that if you touch it at the right phase of flower production, it will actually explode and send its seeds far away from the plant. So it has that little adaptation for spreading its seed. Another neat thing about this plant under the medicinal category is that if you crush up this plant, you can put it on a rash like poison ivy or some other itchy rash, and it helps to stop the itch and cure up the rash that forms. Other medicinal plants that we have in our lakes and ponds, burr reed can be used to address or to help with snake bites. Hedge hyssop is good for stomach problems. And then the happy plant, St. John's wort, is good for mood enhancement. You might often see St. John's wort pills or teas out there. And then a nifty little fact, the smallest flowering plant that we know of is an aquatic. It is watermeal or wolfia is the Latin name. You can see a picture of wolfia at the bottom. So those are the leaves of the plant. They're tiny. They float on the surface of the water and they produce tiny little flowers in the summer months. All right, so we've got some tasty plants as well. You guys might be familiar with these. We do in fact have cranberries growing along the shorelines of some of our lakes. They're not just in bog areas. I know of a few lakes actually just north of you. You can find these growing along the Ossipee Lake system on shore in some of the really acidic areas. Wild rice and watercress are both also food for humans and also for animals, and they are all aquatic. Jumping into some of the endangered plant species, these are all listed here. So there are quite a number of state listed endangered plants. The one you see over here on the right, Houghtonia inflata or featherfoil, is kind of one of the more bizarre looking plants. It has these feather-like leaves at the bottom, and then it has these big, almost succulent stems that come up off that floating rosette, and that floats above the surface. So it's an unusual plant to see. And last summer, for some reason, I don't know if it was because of the drought that we had the year before, this plant was highly common in portions of water bodies across southern New Hampshire. So just a different one. Some of our state threatened species, we just have a few on that list, some bladderworts and burr reeds and some other plants. The bladderwort is shown here with pretty purple flowers on it. So our Natural Heritage Department with our Department of Natural and Cultural Resources actually keeps track of these, and it is their mission to protect native plants. So that is one of the things that they track, and they try to conserve native plants both on land and in the water. So that's their responsibility. If you are interested in what species might be in your area of the state, you can go to this link. And I've already shared this presentation as a PDF with John so that he can make it available to you, so you can have access to all these links and email addresses and stuff that I'll share through the presentation. So you can go check that out and do some searching for these if you are interested in rare plants. So let's talk a little bit about why plants grow where they do. You can even see this is an old tree stump that was sticking above the surface of the water in Highland Lake in Stoddard, New Hampshire. And I grabbed this picture because it just shows you that aquatic plants will take hold in just about any habitat that they can get, whether it's underwater or on an old stump that's sticking up. But they do have pretty specific requirements to grow. They need water, like most plants do. These have a tricky balance though, because they actually live in water. So a lot of times they have to have like a waxy cuticle on the outside of the plant to prevent too much water from getting in, so that it's a balance. They also need nutrients. And even though a lot of these plants are fully underwater, many of them don't take nutrients out of the water column. They actually take nutrients out of the sediment. Again, going back to those carnivorous plants, they get nutrients from the ground, from the soil, but they also get nutrients from the bugs that they eat or the other aquatic life. They need sunlight, and most of these need substrates to root in, but there are a few plants that I'll talk about that are completely floating, free floating. That tiny little duckweed that I talked about, that's the smallest flowering aquatic plant, is completely floating. It's not rooted at all. So they all have their little adaptations. The floaters, of course, will take nutrients right out of the water column. So now I'd like you all to think about standing on the shoreline of your favorite lake and looking out across the water from shore. And I'm just going to talk about the zones that we find these different plants in. So where you're standing on shore, if you look down around your feet, you're going to see the emergent plants. These are the plants that are rooted in the soil, but most of the plant material comes up out of the water or it's right along the bank. So these are the emergent plants, or the rooted out of water plants. As you wade out a little bit deeper, if you get into the 2 to maybe 8 foot depth zone, you're going to get into the floating leafed plants. This includes both the free floaters, like I talked about, and then also the plants that are rooted, but that have leaves that float on the surface of the water, like your yellow lily, your white lily, your duckweeds, your water meals, things like that. And then as you go out a little bit deeper, you get into that submerged zone. And I want to say these two zones, the floating and the submergent, will mix. So you might find these all mixed in with each other. But the submergent zone are those plants that are rooted or unrooted that are completely underwater. So they don't really send anything up to the surface. And then when you get out beyond the zone of plant growth, you get into the plankton zone, or where you tend to have algae dominating the water column. And those are the plants out deep. So taking a look at this in a picture of what a lake is instead of the two-dimensional line drawing, you have your emergent plants close to shore, and you see those in the background here. And then kind of in the middle of the picture, you see all these floating leaf plants. These are all white water lilies. And then you get underneath that, you can see the bits of submergent or underwater plants that are mixed in there. So that is the typical zonation that you would see in most water bodies. Now, most lakes and ponds have anywhere from a dozen to 2 or 3 dozen different types of plants growing in them. And the lakes that are not as nutrient rich or mucky bottomed will tend to have fewer. And then the lakes that do have a little bit more organic bottom and higher nutrients will tend to have more plants. So I was looking at all of the lakes in the Acton Wakefield watershed, and I picked out all of the plants that are listed from our historic plant surveys, and I broke them down into the emergent, submergent, and floating categories. And I want to just show you some pictures of these so you're familiar with them. These are present in a lot of the lakes in the area. So I'm going to start up on the top left and go clockwise. Whoops. With the correct slide. So starting up in the top left, we have burreed. This one almost looks like a little cattail, but it has these little white spike-like flowers in the summer. Sedges, we have sedges in a lot of different water bodies. They usually have these almost catkin-like looking seed structures. Moving over to this one, water lobelia is an interesting one. It's an indicator of good water quality, and it tends to like really rocky or sandy bottom areas. And they are these little skinny stalks, and they have little purple flowers that stick up or actually kind of hang down on the stems. Water smartweed, this one actually has little pink flowers or pinkish flowers growing near the surface. Pipewort is also another indicator of good water quality. This one, I call this one the astroturf of lakes, because it has these couple-inch tall, spiky green shoots off the bottom that almost can form a little green carpet on the bottom. And they often, but not always, send up a skinny stalk with a little white button-like flower on it. So you'll probably see that out there. Rushes, just like sedges, are very common. And the little saying that goes with these is rushes are round and sedges have edges. So if you find something that looks like one of these and you roll it between your fingers, rushes are going to be round. And then sedges will have usually 3 sides to them. Cattails are another one that is a really popular common plant. It's a really good source of water filtration. It takes up a lot of nutrients and a lot of metals that run off from the landscape. So it's almost you would call it a good filter for runoff. So it's a good plant to have, and it's also really good food and really good habitat for aquatic life and birds and other organisms that use lakes and ponds. This one down in the bottom middle is 3-way sedge. So it's a sedge, but it's if you look down on it, if you're standing up over it, it has leaves that come off at 3 angles to the stem. So it's called 3-way sedge. Coming over here to the left to pickerel weed. This one is a really common one in the shallows, usually in 1 to 2 feet of water. You will find it flowering from late June until August. This is also the plant that makes me really sad in the fall, because it's the first aquatic plant to brown up as we get into September and we start getting colder nights. So to me, that tells me, yep, we're just about done with summer. So that's sort of the little harbinger of fall. Moving up, we have arrow arum and arrowhead. They're both very similar. They're 2 different species. Arrowheads typically have thinner, narrower A-shaped leaves. Arrow arum tends to have broader leaves, both right close to shore, forming clusters of these arrow-shaped leaf type plants. And then this last one here is spike rush. This one is sort of skinny green stalk with a tiny little brown, almost lead pencil tip to it, type of little flower stalk there. This one will sometimes be pretty dense in the water column. In the shallows, it also forms more like a ribbon-like type of growth underwater. So it can look almost grassy sometimes underwater. And then moving on, we have our floating leaved plants. So white water lily up here in the upper left. This one, if you guys all remember back to the old Pac-Man game, it's sort of shaped like Pac-Man. It's got a round leaf with a V-knot shape, so you can kind of almost picture the little Pac-Man guy right there. And then, of course, the white flower. The one in the middle on the top is floating heart. That one is tiny. It's about the size of a dollar coin, and they usually form little clusters that grow together. So it's really tiny. Water shield, this one's kind of neat. It looks like a mosaic almost. It has oval leaves, and then the mosaic is with all these different colors that come in throughout the season. Some of the leaves start to die off and change different colors as the season goes on. This one's also supremely slimy. So if you were to touch this one, you'll notice it has a very thick, clear slime coat on the underside of the leaves and on the stems. That's to help keep insects from eating into the leaves and burrowing through the leaves. But if you look closely, you can actually see some insects nibbling away at the leaves. So it doesn't work as well as I think the plant hopes, but it helps some, I think. Yellow water lily. This is actually the first flower that you're going to see in your lake if you have yellow water lilies. It's the first plant to start growing out of the lake bottom in the spring after ice out. And then the flowers will be up shortly after that, usually mid to late April, early May. The leaves of the yellow are more oval shaped, and they have heart-shaped bases as compared to the white lily, which has those round leaves. And then pondweeds. We have about 28 species of pondweed in New Hampshire. Most lakes have 3 or 4 different species. And some of the pondweeds tend to have these floating leaves on the surface. Some of them have just underwater leaves. So the different species have different characteristics, but I put them into the floating leaf category because a lot of them do have floating leaves. And then moving on to the submersed plants. These are the ones that are a little tricky to identify. The upper left and the upper right are both bladderworts. We have, I think, 16 different bladderwort species in New Hampshire. Most lakes have at least one, sometimes 2 or 3 different species. The one on the top left is the more common one. And again, you can see those little blackish, brownish seed-like things. Those are the bellies. And over on the top right, this is world bladderwort. And this one tends to have greenish or whitish little bellies on it. Just different species, different colored flowers. This one has a yellow flower. This one has a purple flower when they flower in the summer. The top middle one here, I know has been a concern for folks over on Province Lake. This is water starwort. It's a completely normal, totally fine plant, but sometimes it can grow in abundance. It's not harmful at all, but it's got these tiny little leaves that float at the top and they almost form a star shape. That's why it's called water starwort. And then as we go down to the bottom left, the bottom right, we have 2 milfoil species. And usually when I'm talking about milfoils, I'm talking about them in a derogatory sense, because it's usually the invasive species that I'm talking about. We actually have 6 native species of milfoil in New Hampshire. They're totally fine. They're well behaved. They're on our good list. The native milfoil on the bottom right is the Latin name is verticillatum for the species. It has these little winter buds that hang off from it. I know for a fact that this one is in Pine River Pond. It's in Balch Lake, probably a couple others in the area. It seems to like that area. And don't be alarmed by this one. This one can get anywhere from 1 to 6 feet tall. So it can get big, but it is not invasive. And they have boom and bust cycles, as most native plants do. Some years they're more abundant, other years they're not. The one in the bottom middle here is native humuli. It tends to have a reddish brownish color to it. And this one only grows about a foot tall. So it's often not noticeable and it often doesn't grow very dense. So that's just another native. The bottom left is tape grass. Some people also call it ribbon grass or eelgrass. And this is just another common native. You might notice if you look closely in the picture, there are these little spirally stalks coming up. They look like little corkscrews. That is a reproductive structure. That's the female reproductive structure of the plant. So usually in July, you'll see these little corkscrews coming up off the bottom, and the male fertilizing part of the plant floats on the surface. And one of my botany professors from the past called this bumper boat reproduction, because the male pollen grain will bump into and fertilize the little corkscrew part of the plant. So bumper boat reproduction on that one. And then the last one here is waterweed. I know that Great East Lake has this one in abundance in a small wetland area, inlet area off the main lake. And some years this one gets super abundant. At the beginning, I mentioned hydrilla, which is an invasive in Maine. That one is very similar looking to waterweed. So we like to get a good look at the waterweed. If you take a close look at the leaves of the native, the leaf edges are smooth and the leaves are usually in whorls of 3 or less. The hydrilla, which is in Pickerel Pond in Limerick, Maine, has leaves that are serrated almost like a steak knife, and they are in whorls of 4 or more. So those distinguishing characteristics are important for identifying the plants. All right, so I want to make a distinction between filamentous green algae, which is totally okay, even though it looks a little unsightly, and cyanobacteria. I know that Pine River Pond, for example, has had some concerns with cyanobacteria the last couple of years. So it's good to know what these look like. So if you see stuff on your lake bottom that looks almost like cotton candy, like bright green cotton candy, or clouds, those are typically fine. If you see anything that looks like, we like to call this one on the bottom left, paint chips floating on the surface in this blue-greenish color, or this skim of material floating on the surface of the water, like in the middle, or even worse, if your pond goes pea soup green, like on the bottom right, those are all things we want to know about. And we have a cyanobacteria hotline in New Hampshire, and Maine has something similar, where you can send photos of scums and have them verified. We also have staff that will go out and collect samples just to look at it underneath the microscope to be absolutely sure what the makeup of that algae is. So keep an eye out. The filamentous green is totally harmless. The cyanobacteria are potentially harmful because they produce liver toxins and neurotoxins. And if you ingest the water, and sometimes if you have contact with the water, they can be harmful. And that sounds scary, and it is in some circumstances, but if you look at the water and it looks clear, you're good. If you look at the water and it has a scum or little flecks in it that look like algae, give us a call before you go for a swim or before you let your dogs or your kids or your grandkids in the water, because it is definitely a concern. So just keep an eye out for anything that looks like cyanobacteria. So now let's move on to that lake aging scenario. In the field of limnology or freshwater biology, we recognize different classifications of lakes. I'm going to start with the oligotrophic types of lakes. Those are the cleaner, clearer, low nutrient, typically deeper lakes with less organic muck at the bottom of them. So those are, I don't want to call them newer lakes, because most of our lakes were formed about 13,000 years ago when the last glacier went through and it plucked out basins. And from that time, our lakes have been all aging, but some of them age at different rates than others, basically because of their watersheds and what's being contributed to the lake from the watershed. So that's oligotrophic lakes. Down at the very bottom is a eutrophic lake. These tend to be much more organic. They tend to have a warm water fishery. They tend to have more plants and algae, high nutrients, less clarity. And then in the middle is a mesotrophic lake, and it has characteristics of either end of the spectrum. And there's a whole spectrum of mesotrophic lakes depending on characteristic. But usually lakes start off as oligotrophic, and over time, hundreds of thousands of years, they should eventually progress to eutrophic. With human development, clearing watersheds, putting impervious surfaces in, cutting down trees, we are making our lakes age in a human lifetime when they haven't done that ever. So we're seeing eutrophication happen a lot faster than we ever have. And just some other pictures of these lake categories. I forgot to mention oligotrophic lakes also tend to be more of a cold water fishery. So your trout, your salmon, species like that, low nutrients, few plants. And then as we work our way through this progression, the mesotrophic lake, it could be a mix of cold and warm water fisheries, generally trending towards warm, more plants, more plant diversity, a little bit more organic matter at the bottom, higher nutrients. And then as we get into the eutrophic system, lots of plant growth, definitely a warm water fishery, lots of organic matter, lots of nutrients. So that's the progression. And the lakes in the Acton Wakefield watershed are either typically oligotrophic. There are a couple of those. Lovell Lake comes to mind for oligotrophic. And then there are a lot of mesotrophic lakes. So there are a lot of lakes that are in the middle of that spectrum and not many eutrophic lakes in the area. So you guys are towards the upper middle category. In addition to lake aging, the shape of a lake basin also determines where plants are going to grow. So if you live on a lake or you have a lake that is very quickly dropping off to deeper water, you don't have a lot of shoreline area, it just drops quickly in depth, that's not going to be a great habitat for a lot of plant growth because they just can't root and reach the surface. If you have a shallower lake where the bottom contour is much more gradual, you have this shelf where you're going to have a lot more plant growth before you drop off to deeper water. So basin contour is going to really contribute a lot to plants. And just taking a look at this, a couple examples. This is an example of a deeper, steep-sided basin, especially along this top shoreline and bottom shoreline, where you're dropping in several feet of depth as you leave shore. And that one is going to have fewer plants. So this is a plant map that we would do as biologists, where we have the lake outline. So it's the same lake that I just showed you. Whoops. Same lake, just showing you plants instead of depth. And these symbols all indicate different types of plants. So if we were to translate that into what it looks like, you're going to have plants out until you drop off deep and you don't have plants anymore. Looking at the other end of the spectrum, here's a really shallow lake. Maximum depth of this one's only 10 feet. And you can see there are several coves where it's less than 5 feet deep. So you can kind of anticipate that this one's going to have a lot more plant growth, and that plant growth is going to come out much farther from shore. And a lot of the lake might look like this. And as you look down the lake, you might have a lot of plants and a lot of organic matter sticking up out of the bottom. So it just sort of is what it is when it comes to lake basin shape. It's just the stage of evolution of that basin. And over many, many years, a lot of our lakes will eventually become wetland areas. Hopefully, many, many lifetimes and thousands of years from now. With that said, there are some lakes that have shallow shelves that extend far out like this one. But if you look at the substrate, it's very cobbly, sandy, rocky, and it's not really conducive to plant growth. So a lot of different factors contribute. Nutrient levels, clarity, how far sunlight penetrates in the water column. These are all things that affect how and where plants grow. And one of the things that we always talk about is that we need to have realistic expectations of our lakes and ponds. lakes are not swimming pools. They're not concrete sided basins that we put chlorine into to make them pristine. They're going to have plant growth. They're going to have algae. They're going to have muck. Lakes are settling basins. They're the low point in the landscape. So no matter what we do, they're the low point in the landscape. So they're going to have plant growth because there's organics and nutrients. So sometimes our water bodies have evolved to a point where, you're not going to have clear runways for power boats and other recreational activities. It's going to be more of a paddling, bird watching, warm water fishing type of lake. Whereas the lakes that are still deep and fewer plants are going to be better for power boating, sailing, swimming, and other types of activities like that. And every lake has its value. It's just, dependent on that stage that a lake is in and what you're going to find in them. So with that said, as a biologist, I do hear a lot of concerns about plant growth. And these are a lot of the things that I hear. I just listed some of them here. It's kind of interesting, the different perspectives that are out there about plants and the things that plants harbor. So the question comes up, what is that threshold when a little bit of plant growth is too much? Is there a rating system for this, and what does it depend on? So any of you that are involved in surface water quality monitoring know that we have standards for number of bacteria or level of phosphorus or other nutrients that we measure a lake's water quality and compare to standards. In New Hampshire, we have surface water quality standards. Maine does as well. And under that, we require that a surface water supports a designated use. And a designated use could be something like primary contact recreation, so it's swimming, or secondary contact recreation, so it's boating, or wildlife habitat, or something like that. So we have all these designated uses defined for generally water chemistry when it comes to oxygen or nutrients. When it comes to plants, though, if we look at all of our designated uses, so aquatic life use, contact recreation, and wildlife, there are no thresholds and there are no numbers to compare for native aquatic plant density. So there's nothing that we can look to that says, yep, that's too much. So it kind of makes it hard. It's very subjective in terms of how much plant material is too much. We don't draw the line. And in fact, when we're thinking about native plants, we tend to view them as beneficial for a water body because they provide all those functions that I talked about at the beginning of the slideshow. So when you're taking a look at lakes and ponds, you can take a look at our abundance rating. This is a qualitative rating, so we don't put a number on it. It's just our perception of how these plants are distributed. So if you remember the maps that I showed you that had the symbols around the shoreline, they equate to different types of plants. As you can see here, we've got the Latin name, we've got the common name, and some of these look familiar from what I showed you are present in your area. I actually grabbed this list from Horn Pond in Wakefield. And you can see that we have gone through, and when we surveyed Horn Pond, we listed each plant and we listed a general abundance for those plants. So scattered is just a few plants. Scattered common gets a little bit more abundant. And then we also have other categories that aren't on this particular list, but we have abundant and very abundant. So we have sort of that whole spectrum from sparse, where there's a few, and abundant, where there's more than 50% cover. So the general rating for each plant is listed, and at the bottom we give an overall abundance. So for Horn Pond, the overall abundance is scattered common for the plants. And then we also will give a little narrative of something that we may have seen out on the lake. So for New Hampshire, you guys can go to our DES Lake Mapper, and I've got a link to that in the spreadsheet in the slideshow. And you can go pull up plant maps for your individual water bodies. And for Maine, you can do that for several water bodies. They don't have it for all water bodies. And I'll share the link for Maine and New Hampshire with you in a few slides so that when you get this PDF of the PowerPoint, you can go and look for yourself what you've got in your lakes and check it out and see how it's been rated. And I kind of alluded to some of this from our sparse to very abundant ratings. And again, it's narrative. We don't assign numbers to it. So that's how we rate plants. So then we get to the question of, well, we've got plants. In our perspective, we have a lot of plants. When, why, and how can we manage these? So I want to say that, again, we like native plants because they provide all of these values. They're part of the natural system and they are beneficial in a lot of ways. And you're not really going to stop the process of native plant growth. It's almost like opening up a plot for your garden for the summer, and you have plants that come in that are unintended, like the weeds that come in. So anytime you have a habitat that's conducive, you're going to have plant growth. So with that said, there are caveats for management. But again, just factor in some of these things. If you like to fish, a lot of our fish require certain levels of plant cover. The warmer water fishery type of plants like northern pike require 80% plant cover. That's why we don't have a lot of northern pike in our area, because we don't have that much plant cover on most water bodies. Bass actually like a lot too. They like 40 to 60% plant cover. And then bluegill and yellow perch a little bit less. When you get into the cold water fishery, they don't really like plant growth because it's organic matter. And that's a different type of lake and a different type of fish, but warm water fishing, plants are important. If you like to bird, hunt or watch, the plants are good for food and for shelter for a lot of the plants. I already talked about one, the cattail, that provides a lot of food and shelter, but grasses, rushes, sedges all provide really good shelter. And then again, just a reminder of all the different functional values that these plants provide. And I talked about that in detail. So moving on to when and how to manage. So I want to say that permits are always required. In New Hampshire and in Maine, permits are required if you want to do any plant management. So if you have a shore frontage where you've got your dock and you've got a little swim area, both states will allow for you to do some type of management in those areas to clear a little swim area or to clear an area so your boat can come in and out of your dock. You just have to do it the right way, and you also have to check in and see what permits are needed or if permits are needed. So I've provided the phone numbers to both the New Hampshire and the Maine agencies that deal with the permitting of physical mechanical removal. So that's raking, digging, pulling up of plants in their root systems. So I know it seems really benign, but raking, so wading into the water with a rake and raking the lake bottom of plants actually does require a permit. A lot of people do it without permits, but the law is that permits are required for those activities. So just, I don't want anybody to get in trouble. So just always check in before you do any management. And then a really important item here is for herbicide or chemical treatment, always needs a permit, and you usually need a licensed applicator to do it. I'm aware of a lake where a homeowner took it upon themselves to purchase a product through the mail and deliver it to the water column from their pontoon boat on their own, which honestly scares me. They don't know dosing, they don't know the right chemical, they don't know what, in most cases, plants they're dealing with. And they could not only harm aquatic life, but they could also harm humans if people go swimming and don't know there's an herbicide in the water. And if it's, a lot of times people think, I'll just add a little extra, it'll be better, it'll take care of it a little better. And it's that's very concerning. So that's why herbicides are highly regulated, and it's done by a licensed applicator, and it's all done very scientifically based on water volume, the right chemical for the right plant, and the right dose for the right plant. So that scenario that I mentioned of the homeowner, that person was fined heavily by the Department of Agriculture that does the permitting for herbicides. So there are hefty fines, and there could be water quality violations, which will bring other fines. So it's not a good idea to self-manage a lake like that. So the controls that are out there, physical controls are generally used for native plants. They can be anything from raking or cutting. There are these weed rollers that are out there that supposedly mash plants down to the sediment. There are placement of almost like screening material or bottom barriers. Drawdown is also a technique that people ask about for native plant management because it's cheap and easy if you have a dam. But some plants are resistant to drawdown. Some will get controlled by drawdown, and some will actually get thicker if they're exposed by drawdown. So it's really important to know what you have before you make a problem worse. Mechanical cutting is useful for some plants like pondweeds or other natives like lily pads, or a hydro raking technique, which actually removes plants from the sediment and then they can be offloaded on shore. And then herbicides. So those are the different management techniques that are out there that can be used, but again, with a permit for those. And these are the types of costs for management, different types of techniques, and the cost per hour, per day, and then per acre, depending on which type of management practice you're thinking about. And just to let you know, in New Hampshire and in Maine, there are no state funds to support native plant management. So anybody that's pursuing management of natives would need to pay for that out of pocket. And just, I talked about most of this, but these are just that it's never okay just to go do something on your own without asking. Another item too is it's not okay to dump or deposit sand under the water in a lake to make the bottom less mucky. Both states require permits for sand beaches and for replenishment of those sand beaches. I think it's every 6 or 7 years is allowed, but even doing something like sand placement, even though it's a natural soil substrate, requires a permit. And the rationale behind that is that sand grains have a lot of, if you look at them underneath the microscope, they have a lot of different sides and angles to them. It's a lot of surface area and a lot of nutrients stick to that surface area. So if you're bringing sand in, you're also bringing nutrients into the lake, which could cause nearshore algal blooms. So it is sort of a double-edged sword there. So some of the things that you can do naturally to limit plant growth in the lake in front of a shorefront property, keep trees on your shoreline. Overhanging canopies from trees will act as a shade or an umbrella so that if there's less light on the shoreline edge, there'll be less plant density. Avoid fertilizer on your shorefront. A lot of the soils in our region, both in New Hampshire and Maine, are not nutrient limited. They are actually pH limited. So you need more lime than you do nutrients. And about 75% of the nutrients that people put on their lawns actually end up in lakes. So it runs right off. It doesn't really get taken up by the plants. So you're just fertilizing the lake. Another recommendation, so for anybody in a watershed on a septic system, have your septic system pumped and checked. People that live right on the lake edge should have their system pumped every year. I'm sorry, once every 1 to 3 years. And then houses that are a couple tiers back or farther back in a watershed every 3 to 5 years. That helps get all the organics out and make sure the septic system is functioning well and hopefully not allowing as many nutrients out into the watershed, which could leach into the lake. And then if you have any erosion problems on your shoreline, stabilize those. Rock riprap, low growing bushes, anything to stabilize those areas will help limit sediment from getting in. Sediment getting into the lake not only brings in nutrients, but it creates little deltas, and those deltas will grow plants. So those are just some tips to help limit plant growth overall in your water body. Now, for those of you who are really interested in aquatic plants, I have other presentations that are recorded that you can take a look at that goes through plant ID in more detail, or I recommend some references here so that you can learn more about aquatic plants. Some of these publications are excellent. The Pond and Brook book, Pond and Brook book is very interesting. It's got a lot of really neat stuff on ecology. The Swamp and Bog book is really good too. Lots of really good reading in there about habitat, aquatic life, interesting things about bugs. So some great resources there. So if you would like to learn more, these are really good resources. If you are uncertain what is growing in a lake and you want to know what it is, I am happy to look at plants for you. The easiest way to do that is to collect a specimen. Not a whole bunch of specimens, but like a representative of each plant, put it on a piece of white paper towel or a piece of white paper and take a digital picture of it. So use your smartphone or a digital camera and then email me that picture. If you can put something in the photo, like a ruler or a pen or a coin for scale, that will help me. And if you arrange the plant so that I can see the leaves and any flowers well, that would be helpful. But just email that to me. I check my email all the time and I'll get back to you right away with an identification. Most of the time when people send me stuff, it's natives, but if it is an invasive, I'll definitely follow up. I'll follow up with you either way. But if it's an invasive, I will let you know that we'll be out to survey and we'll survey and figure out the distribution of the plant. And then if we need to do management, we'll do that. If it's a native, I'll just let you know what it is and that it's benign. So access to plant maps. I mentioned the DES Lake Mapper. This URL is really long, so just go into Google and type in NHDES Lake Mapper, and that will bring you into this little interface right here. If you zoom in to a water body and you click it, this one here popped up with, you can see we've done trophic survey reports. You can click on these links to get you to lake reports that have maps in them so that you can actually see your depth map and your plant map. You can see if there's a volunteer program on the water body, if there's been a nutrient issue and there's been a total maximum daily load study. It tells you if there's been a bloom history. If you scroll down a little bit more, you would see if there are any invasive plants in that water body. So it tells you a whole lot about water bodies in New Hampshire. So that is a resource for you to check out your own lake or spy on other lakes and see what's out there. In Maine, you can go to the Lake Stewards of Maine pages, and you can, in their little dialog box, type in your lake name and the town, and it will bring up a page. I did Grady's Lake here on the bottom right. You can see all kinds of stuff. You can do a lake overview, water quality. I clicked on lake life, and you can click on plants underneath that, and that will give you a list of plants that are found in Grady's Lake. You can look up all kinds of other stuff, loons, mussels and crayfish, invasive species. So this for Maine is the one-stop shop for finding out information about lakes. In terms of plant mapping, I showed you a few of the plant maps that we've done in New Hampshire. For Maine and New Hampshire, most of our plant surveys are done as part of lake assessments, and the number of those are limited in a year. A lot of us who are biologists that do invasive species programs tend to map invasives all the time. So we don't really update the native plant maps, but you could find your historic maps, and you could either, if you want an updated map, you could hire a contractor to do that for you. I would say if you do that, just have them do a simple plant survey with a map. They have other technical surveys that they offer that are way more expensive and way more involved than anybody really needs, unless you have some special study going on. And then another option is to try it yourself. Use those plant books and resources and an old map to go around and update whatever types of plants you have in the lake today. And that is kind of a fun summer activity to do. And that is all I have for the presentation. I am happy to take questions.
Great. Thank you very much, Amy. That was really informative. So yeah, if anyone does have questions for Amy, please feel free to put them in the chat, or if you want to try like the hand raise feature in Zoom, I might see that too and ask a question that way. I wanted to start off with a question or two, if that's okay, Amy, from what I was hoping to touch on.
Yeah, of course.
So I was wondering if you could explain that, like the names of the lake classifications, like oligotrophic, like what those words mean to people, because you kind of described what they are, but I was hoping you could explain like the trophic level, kind of that whole thing, and why each one gets each name to start.
Yeah, so being Greek, I'll go to the Greek on this. So trophic is relating to the nutrient or the feeding level of a lake. So oligotrophic lakes, again, are those really low nutrient lakes. New Hampshire and Maine both use rating classifications. And what goes into determining the trophic classification of a lot of lakes goes down to typically chlorophyll, which is the amount of algae in the water column, the amount of dissolved oxygen in the water column, and the amount of nutrients in the water column. So based on our sampling and the results that we get from the sampling, we will go in and rate a lake based on a range of each of those characteristics. In New Hampshire, we actually also add aquatic plants into that ranking system. So we have a ranking and a category for aquatic plants as well. So it's either a 3-part or 4-part ranking system for oligotrophic, mesotrophic, or eutrophic. So the lower the nutrients, the lower the algae, the higher the oxygen, that's going to be more of an oligotrophic lake. And then eutrophic lakes are high nutrients, low. Oh, I'm sorry. I also forgot clarity. We measure clarity too. So that's a factor. Better clarity is oligotrophic. So eutrophic is low clarity, high nutrients, high algae, high plants. So in those lake reports that I showed you, those lake assessment reports on the New Hampshire side of the DES lake mapper, you can see how we rank those lakes based on those criteria. Does that answer your question?
Oh yeah, absolutely. Thank you. Just wanted to clear that up for everybody. I think it's important to know. I feel like the eutrophic gets like a bad reputation kind of. So I was wondering if you wanted to touch on that a little bit more, like how there's no good and bad in ecology, and what like the ecosystem benefits of that system are as well. Yeah,
that's a really good question. And you'll notice I did not talk about good and bad lakes because there's not a good or a bad lake. Eutrophic lakes to me are fascinating because they have so much more in them than oligotrophic lakes. There's a lot more to look at. There's a lot more aquatic life. The plants are really interesting to look at. So you can, find a lot of stuff. So I actually find eutrophic lakes much more interesting because of that. Oligotrophic lakes are definitely the other end of the spectrum. They're a little bit more sterile, if you will, in terms of aquatic life, but they have their value too. In time, they will become mesotrophic or eutrophic, but they just haven't gotten there yet. So yeah, not a good or a bad. It's just different perspectives. And that's why I said different perspectives. And it's important to keep that in mind. If you want to go bass fishing, you're not going to go to an oligotrophic lake because there's just not going to be enough habitat to support an awesome bass fishery. If you want to get the lunker bass, you got to go to the eutrophic lake because there's more plants and habitat and structure there.
Thank you. Let's see. Charlie Crespi pointed out in a direct message in the chat that the water quality data for Great East Lake is on the New Hampshire website. And he said he hadn't seen it on the main website. So folks might want to go check both of them just to make sure they get the right information. Other than that, I had a quick question. I had heard that one of the lilies, one of the water lilies was a non-native. Is that true, or are they both native species?
So both of our white and yellow water lilies are native. Okay. So Nymphea, which is the genus for the white water lily, has pink water lilies in it. They're different species, same genus. And some people have introduced pink water lilies because they think they're pretty.
Okay.
And they are pretty, and they are the same genus as the whites, but they are a different species. There's nothing harmful about doing that directly, but I want to tell you that most of the nurseries that grow and sell aquatic plants have mixed cultures of plants growing. And if you're ordering a pink water lily, you might get a whole lot more than that. A lot of times there are seeds or fragments of other plants mixed in. And I can tell you that often when people buy pink water lilies, there's hydrilla mixed in. So it's very scary to be buying plants and introducing them into lakes. I can tell you as an example that I had a sterile tank, fish tank at the office, and I had an intern bring back an aquatic plant. So in addition to doing lake surveys, we survey pet stores for them illegally selling plants, pet stores and nurseries. So my interns go out and check on stores to see if they're selling something they shouldn't be, because a lot of the invasive plants are prohibited. So an intern brought a plant back to me and I identified it, and then I put it in the aquarium. This aquarium was started fresh in the lab. It was sterilized. That plant, after I introduced it, I had other plants growing. I had a snail and I had a baby fish in the aquarium a couple of weeks after that plant was put into that sterile aquarium.
Wow.
So just because you're getting a plant doesn't mean you're just getting a plant. So yeah, the pinks
You
are
don't necessarily recommend people buying aquatic plants to put in the lake.
I don't.
Okay.
But to directly answer your question, white and yellow are native, pinks are not.
Okay.
But that's the whole story behind it.
Awesome. That's good. Yeah, that's interesting. Because I had kind of heard something like that, but I wasn't quite sure what the full story was. All right, the last question from me, this is sort of a permitting question for folks. This was seems like a small thing, but I noticed on one of your slides, it said that you could rake within a 900 square foot area. So is there a certain area that you don't need permitting for, or do you still need permitting no matter what if you're raking? And then the second half is, who should folks contact for permitting?
Yep, that's a good question. So in New Hampshire, we have permit by notification, and in Maine, there's permit by rule. So I would still say that no matter what you want to do, check in with your respective agencies, depending on which state you're in, and ask before you do it. In New Hampshire, raking is allowed if the lake level is down. So if you have a drawdown and the bottom is exposed, you can legally rake the lake bottom. If the water level's up and you're raking underwater, that is technically illegal without a permit.
All right, that is very clarifying. Thank you. That is the, okay, I actually have one more quick question. This is just my plant nerd coming out. I'm really excited about trying to find Wolfia, and I was wondering where and when you can find that if you go hunting for it.
Yeah, so you need to find a really organic wetland or backwater area. You're not going to find Wolfia or duckweed on a lake or pond. So as you're out and about driving in the watershed, where you have culvert crossings on roads, those areas that are impounded by the culvert, well, not impounded, but kind of held up by the culvert, those areas are where you're typically going to find Wolfia or a duckweed species.
Okay, so not in the lake.
Not in the lake. They don't typically grow in lakes because there's too much water movement and I guess not enough nutrients. They need like a wetland area that has higher nutrient levels.
Cool. Well, I'll be hunting for the smallest aquatic flower this spring. That'll be a fun activity. Cool.
I can't think of anything in your watershed directly, but try those little wetlands that are along roadways.
Okay. Well, I don't see any questions in the chat. If you have any final comments, please feel free to share. I will, for those of you that are still here, I'm going to make Amy provided me with the PDF for the PowerPoint, so I'll make that available to everybody that registered for this presentation, and the recording will be available on our website as well. So anybody can watch it again if they need to.
Thank you.
Yep, thank you. And or thanks for coming. And any final comments on your end, Amy?
No, thank you all for coming. It was nice to talk with you.
Awesome. Great. Well, thank you so much, and have a great night.
Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye.